Okay, hey Vikings, how's it going? This is the third part of the video. This is Unit 2. I did two other videos, Unit 1, and then the first part of the test before. So go ahead and look out for those. Unit 2 is all about the three branches of government. We also include the bureaucracy in that because they are under the executive branch. So I'm going to go ahead and present on this. This is the Google Slides for the updated edition for this year's test. This is Unit 2. So let's go ahead and jump in. And as always, if you have questions, please let me know. This unit is a big chunk of the test because it's basically the three branches and how they interact with each other. So checks and balances, the separation of powers. You need to know the three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial. You need to know what they do and then what powers that they have to kind of stop maybe the other branch from doing something, basically. So let's jump right in. All right. So again, I'm going to read this out loud and I might pause and highlight some important things to just kind of note and stuff like that. Because power is widely distributed and checks prevent one branch from usurping powers from others, institutional actors are in the position where they must both compete and cooperate in order to govern. So you're going to have the branches that are competing with one another because they're both striving to influence public policy, but they also have to cooperate with one another in order to actually execute it. The three key institutions of the federal government are the Congress, presidency, and the courts. The bureaucracy, which implements policy, is seen by some as an extension of the executive branch and by others as, in effect, a fourth branch of government because of the discretion it can exercise in carrying out policy directives. So some people say like the fourth branch of government would be the bureaucracy because they're the ones actually implementing and putting the laws into place. The Constitution grants specific powers to Congress, the president, and the courts. And in addition, each branch exercises informal powers. So remember, informal is like outside the Constitution. So judicial review is not in the Constitution. So that's an example of a informal power. So informal powers developed through political practice, tradition, and legislation. Sorry, let me move my deal so I can read the rest. Cool. Because checks and balances are designed to prevent one branch from becoming too powerful, Congress and the president, for example, will sometimes cooperate and sometimes compete. So, and we're even seeing this right now where, the president and the Congress were working together to try to get this stimulus package, get some money out there to small businesses and consumers and all this kinds of stuff. But there's also competition that's going around as far as like who should get the loans and how should that look like and what kind of oversight should there be and all that kinds of stuff. Because, initially they were going to release a bunch of money and put no regulations or restrictions on it. And the Senate Democrats were like, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't sound so good. We want to know who's going to be overseeing this. We're glad that we're going to give out money to businesses. We want to make sure it goes to the right people and it's not just going to already wealthy companies that really don't need it kind of thing. All right, so the powers of Congress are set forth in Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress is bicameral. Bicameral just means that there's two houses, right? We have a House and we have a Senate. With the Senate representing the states and the House of Representatives reflecting each state's population. So remember, every state gets two senators, so the Senate is completely equal as far as the states go. But every state gets at least one representative, and then based on population, you'll get more. So for example, California has 53 representatives, and by far the most just because we are the most populous state. And so that's what the House is more about, just representing the population centers. Congress passes laws that cover a wide range of policy areas, and each chamber has different responsibilities and rules. That's a key thing that we'll go over in just a little bit as far as like what can the Senate do, what can the House do. Tend to get a little bit more trivial with that. That tends to seem more in multiple choice and stuff, but definitely they could ask you that as far as they could give you a scenario and say, what would the Senate do? And if you start listing House powers, you wouldn't get the points on that. The federal budget is a good example of how the president and Congress must cooperate and compromise. While Congress is empowered to develop and pass a budget, in the modern era, the president typically proposes one, which may lead to ideological debate. There are several reasons it is difficult for Congress to pass legislation, including ideological differences. Much of the work of Congress is done in committees, and congressional committees also exercise oversight to ensure that the bureaucracy is carrying out policies as intended. The express powers of the president are set forth in Article 2 of the Constitution. The president has a significant degree of informal power, which has grown over time. That's a key. That's actually one of our enduring understandings, the expansion of the presidency. You know, if you look at the formal powers, it's pretty limited as far as what a president can do. But through bargaining and persuasion, through the veto, just even threatening a veto can get the president to get his policy initiatives in there. If he says to Congress, like, hey, I like the law you're going to pass, but stick this stuff in there. And if you don't, I'll veto it. Then Congress is like, well, we better compromise because we want to get the law passed, kind of thing. Under the Constitution, Congress checks the power of the president, and this leads to a tension between the two branches over both foreign and domestic affairs. So Congress and the president fight, especially when they have ideological differences. If you've got a Senate that's Democratic and a president that's Republican, they're going to have different, usually, like I said, they usually will agree on the problems, but they usually disagree on how to solve those problems or the degree of, necessary to try to do it, quickly, that kind of thing. The president and Congress have several interrelated powers. For example, while Congress passes legislation, the president must sign it into law. The president appoints judges and members of the cabinet who must be confirmed by the Senate. The president also oversees most of the bureaucracy. Technology has impacted the president's use of the bully pulpit to influence public opinion. So technology has changed the way that the president communicates to the public. The bully pulpit is just, the president's power to use their position of authority to get the message out there and that kinds of stuff. We're seeing, Trump's going on TV every day now, and he's using that new technology of, social media and that kinds of stuff to try to interact with people and try to get his message out there, both on like what he's doing to help people and help the country, but also he's interested in putting a good message out there that could maybe help his reelection hopes. In addition to reaching out to the public through televised press conferences and State of the Union message, the president is increasingly making use of social media. So they want us to know, yes, technology is changing the way that presidents communicate, and they're definitely using it. President Trump says Twitter helped to get him elected. So he definitely understands the power of social media for sure. Okay, to communicate views to a vast audience. All right. The federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, established under Article 3, is designed to be an independent branch of government. The court's far-reaching power judicial review was justified in Marbury v. Madison, where the court declared that it had the constitutional authority to overturn acts of Congress, state laws, or executive action deemed to be unconstitutional. Key concept, judicial review. It's the only check that the courts have. That's basically it. Nothing else specific that they can do to stop the president from doing something, to stop the Congress from doing something. And that was established, not written in the Constitution. That was established in the case Marbury v. Madison. Basically, the Chief Justice was like, well, it's our job to interpret the law, and the Constitution is law. And so that means it's our job to interpret the Constitution. And since it's the supreme law of the land and we're allowed to interpret it, if we say something you're doing below is no good, we're the ones who get to call it out, basically. And the other branches and the people were just like, oh, okay, we'll allow it. So, but it's not specifically in the Constitution. That's something that came out of that case, Marbury versus Madison. Appointed for life, justices are somewhat insulated from public opinion. It is not surprising that over the years, the court has handed down decisions that have been unpopular and controversial. So do remember that the judges are not elected, so they're not accountable to us directly. Congress can impeach them, but that tends to be very, very rare. But they don't have to worry about, is this decision going to be popular? Are people going to vote for them again? They don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. So they really, they're free from that kind of public pressure, basically. Congress and the president may influence the court through the appointment process by refusing to implement a court decision or by passing legislation that changes the court's jurisdiction. So if the Congress and the president don't like a Supreme Court decision, the president could just say, okay, I'm just not going to implement it. Because remember, the execution of these decisions is done by the executive branch, and the Congress can play a part in also executing the laws as well. So that's a great example of that is Andrew Jackson. He famously, with the Trail of Tears case, he lost that case, and the court was like, hey, you can't do that. And he was like, kind of watch me. He said, Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it, knowing that the Supreme Court doesn't have enforcement power. So that's kind of him just trolling the court, going like, haha, like, you told me I can't do this, but I'm going to do it anyways. And Congress isn't going to impeach me. So, too bad. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Okay, using a merit-based system for all staff except for top-level political appointees, the federal bureaucracy carries out laws to regulate a wide range of individual and commercial activities. Bureaucrats implement policy using their discretionary and rulemaking authority. Both Congress and the president can hold the bureaucracy accountable in policy implementation. And the two branches will sometimes be in conflict over whether or not administrative agencies are carrying out the letter and spirit of the law. So whenever a new president comes in, he'll definitely direct the bureaucracy in one direction or try to say, like, this is the way I want you to enforce these laws or do this. And Congress may or may not disagree with that, but definitely there's potential for conflict. Now, remember that if there's a bureaucratic action that goes against the Constitution, or if they're not enforcing the law how it's written, you can be challenged in the courts, and the courts can rule on that as well. So sometimes Congress will go, you know what, fine, we're just going to sue you then, and we'll have the courts rule on whether or not we have the ability to, allow you to do that, or we don't want you to do that kind of thing. Excuse me. Okay, essential questions. How do the branches of the national government compete and cooperate in order to govern? To what extent have changes in the powers of each branch affected how responsive and accountable the national government is in the 21st century? One thing that we've seen, and especially major crises, have allowed presidents to take on more power, and a lot of times they haven't given it up. So we've seen, especially in modern times, president taking on more responsibility, taking on more power to try to, handle national crises and national issues and that kind of stuff. And we see this current president kind of going back and forth. Sometimes he says, because I've been watching some of his press conferences, and sometimes he's saying, yeah, I have the authority and I have the power and the governors have to do what I say. And then at other points, he's like, actually, they call the shots and I'm just here to support them and I'm a backup and that kinds of stuff. So he's definitely been, kind of messaging different things on, different situations. Maybe he does want to have the control. Other times he wants to say, you know what, this is your area, so you take it on. Okay, enduring understanding. The Republican ideal in the U.S. is manifested in the structure and operation of a legislative branch. Republican ideal, they're not talking about Republican and Democrats there, they're talking about the idea of just a representative government. So the idea that we elect our leaders, right? Our members of Congress are our leaders. We elect them and they go to represent us. So, I'm always very specific to say, whenever a representative does something, I'm like, hey, I pay you. My tax dollars pay your salary. So you better be doing the right things. If not, like if I found out, our representatives are two senators and Jimmy Panetta, if I found out that they were, misusing the public trust, or if they were doing things that I thought were inappropriate or anything like that, I wouldn't vote for them again. I would be like, I don't want you to represent me, and I don't want you to be trying to pass laws that maybe I disagree with, or I don't like, your moral code or stuff like that. What is the legislative branch? I've got a video link that you can click on there that just basically goes over the overview of what it is. Remember, it's the legislative branch is the Congress, and it has two houses. We are bicameral. You have a House of Representatives and you have a Senate. Okay, so what should I know about the House and Senate? Know what enumerated or sometimes delegated or expressed powers are. They're interchangeable. I mean, enumerated, these are the powers that are in the Constitution. Enumerated because they're numbered, delegated because they were given to the national government by the people, by the states, and expressed because they're clearly expressed. Like Congress has the power to declare war. That's an expressed power, and it's clear. So they're kind of they're all the same thing, but they're named different, they have different names for different reasons, that kind of stuff, but it's all the same thing. Those are the powers to Congress under the Constitution, necessary and proper and elastic clause. That's the idea that there's also a part of the Constitution that allows them to stretch their powers, go beyond what's specifically expressed or what's specifically enumerated. We should know it's bicameral, so there's two houses. We also should know that it's bicameral, and that's a result of a compromise between the large states and the small states, because you have the small states saying, let's just have a Senate and equality among the states. And then you have the large states saying, forget that, let's just have by population. So that's why they did the compromise. And then we also should know the constitutional responsibilities and powers of each house. So let's jump into that. As far as the delegated, enumerated, and express powers of Congress, there's 18 of them. You don't need to know all 18. Here's the ones that come up more often than not. You should know that Congress has the power to collect taxes. They have the power to borrow money and to regulate commerce. They also have the power to coin money. Coining money I see come up a lot too. So the states, for example, are not allowed to make their own currency. That's what I mean. Coining money just means printing money or making money, basically. On war powers, really the only war power you need to know is that they have the power to declare war. I mean, yeah, they have the power to raise an army and maintain the Navy and that kinds of stuff, but that kinds of stuff doesn't usually come up on the test. So declaring war is a key thing. Know that that's a congressional power. The authority to declare war is not actually with the president. That's where they conflict, though, sometimes, because the president has the power to control the troops. So, we've had only 5 wars, but we've had over 500 military conflicts and engagements. And some of those Congress endorsed, and other times they, maybe there was conflict and that kind of stuff. So I would just know those specific powers. The structure and powers of each house. Know that the Senate is designed about equality, that different chambers and constituencies, there's the debate changes because of different sizes. So in the House, for example, it's very strict and regimented because they only have so much time and there's so many people, 4 times the amount of people. In the Senate, they just talk all day, basically. There's not a lot of rules and restrictions on them. That coalitions are affected by term length differences. Definitely in the House, you are hustling. You are every 2 years on the clock, up for re-election. So much more. I would say if I'm in the House too, I'm much more likely to be a delegate and just vote how my constituents want. It's really scary for me to have to vote what I think is best, knowing that I'm up for re-election in 2 years. A senator is much easier able to take on that trustee model. So we should know that Congress passes the federal budget. They raise money. They also can coin it. They declare war and they maintain the armed forces. And that they also can enact legislation that goes beyond those enumerated powers. This would be them using the necessary and proper clause going, okay, well, commerce we're allowed to regulate. So are we allowed to regulate what businesses pollute and clean air? And basically the courts have said, yeah, no, that you are. So, just stuff like that. That doesn't say specifically in the Constitution that Congress is allowed to pass laws to, have clean airways or clean water and that kind of stuff. But they've passed major laws around that. And they basically said, well, it's related to commerce. These businesses are polluting. And so we are allowed to tell them how much they're allowed to pollute or where they can pollute and all that kinds of stuff. Or other social issues around as far as like discrimination, that kinds of stuff. Can we pass a law that says that if you're a business, you can't discriminate against people of color? Yes, the Congress can. And the courts were challenged on that, or not the courts, but a motel was challenged on that and said, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to let certain people into our hotels and we should be allowed to. And the courts were like, yeah, too bad. And the Congress does have the ability to put rules and regulations on you because you're a business, you're commerce, and they're allowed to put those laws on there, for public safety or, just what we think is right. And we think that people should be allowed to go into the restaurants. Okay. So what are the powers? The chamber specific powers in the House and Senate. So House, what should we know? Initiate revenue bills, sole power of impeachment, and there's 435 of them, and it's based on size. For the Senate is the one that offers advice and consent, both on like judges and major presidential appointments. So if the president wants to appoint someone to a top level position in government, they have to go through the Senate and basically get a stamp of approval. And the Senate has to say, okay, yeah, we like this person. We think they're good. Because we just didn't want the president just appointing people that were unqualified. That would be a little scary. Conducts impeachment trials and holds the power to remove impeached officials. So you saw that this year, actually. We had an impeachment trial. And in that case, the Senate voted. It's a high bar to impeach a president. And now, up to this point, now 3 presidents have been impeached, but no president has been removed from office. Both Johnson, Clinton, and now Trump all were impeached, but none of them were removed from office. It only takes 50% to impeach, so it's a much lower bar, much higher bar to actually remove someone from office. It needs 2/3 vote, basically. So, there it is, 2/3 required for removal. So, approves treaties as well. So, the Senate is basically, they're going to, I think you're going to have much more conflict with the Senate and the president because they have a lot more stamp of approval and get to voice their, thoughts on who he's choosing and that kind of stuff. Okay, 100 members and then 2 from each state. So the structure, you should know that they have committees and the committees conduct hearings, they debate bills and that kinds of stuff. And that definitely affects the policymaking process, that they have those specific types of rules. It's hard to pass a law because there are so many rules and there are so many, roadblocks and that kinds of stuff. And, we just got a major law passed, but that happened because of a major crisis. The Congress had not been passing any kind of major legislation. But then, of course, once coronavirus hits, and then that's a major crisis, that's something that does get Congress to act. Even there was one senator, because there was a worry that maybe the bill wouldn't get passed. And the senator was like, we have to. Otherwise, it was going to get passed. He's like, we have to do it. It's not even a question. It's just, what's it going to look like? But we're doing this. And that's not what we're fighting about, basically. It's just, what's this going to look like and all that kind of stuff. Know that there's the filibuster and cloture in the Senate. There's just a lot more rules in the Senate that make it harder to pass laws as well. The House also does have a rules committee that allows them to basically put more rules on bills, makes it harder to pass, and that kind of stuff. Okay, cool. So let's jump into differences in the chambers. So House is more centralized. It's more formal structure, a lot more rules. In the Senate, less formal. It's less centralized. The leadership's not as strong in the Senate, because if I'm in the House and the Speaker of the House says, you better vote for this bill, otherwise we're not going to fund your re-election effort, then I'm like, okay, then I better do it. If I'm in the Senate, I could go, but I'm not up for re-election for 5 years. So go ahead. I don't care. I'll be able to raise the funds, or you won't be mad at me by then anyways. There's few limits on debate in the Senate. It is more personal. They're much more friendly to each other just because it's smaller. They tend to be generalists in public policy just because they are covering a whole state, not just a small geographic area. Okay, why is it difficult to pass legislation and laws? There's all these debate rules, and so it's very difficult to pass laws because of all the restrictions. And if the Speaker doesn't want your bill to pass, it's not going to pass basically because they control this House Rules Committee that allows them to just basically make it really difficult and a struggle for your bill to even reach the floor. Okay, holds and unanimous consent allows the Senate to prevent action. So in the Senate, they also have this holds thing, and they can just basically, one senator can totally ruin everything and basically be like, you know what, I don't want to consider this. And until we get that person on board, basically it's just going to sit and not do anything. There's over 250 bills that the House has passed that the Senate has not even considered, that they're not even being scheduled or anything like that. And that's because the House is Democratic and the Senate is Republican. And so the Senate is like, we don't want any of your bills. And so that just really goes to show you how difficult it is. One House can pass it, and that doesn't mean that it's going to get passed. Also, party leadership. You've got the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, other leadership. Basically, the leaders of the party are going to have a major influence on whether or not your thing's going to get passed. And then I do have a rap for that too. Welcome to my house. Welcome to my house. Parties take control now. We can't even slow down. We don't want to get voted out. All right, there's a little acapella for you. But yeah, I got a rap for that basically shows the power of the leadership and how strong they are. Okay, explain how congressional behavior is influenced the election process, partisanship, and divided government in the U.S. is manifest in the structure. Okay, cool. So this is basically the idea of that we have ideological divisions. They believe different things, and that's why they fight and that kinds of stuff. This is also the idea of what kind of model of representative are you? Are you a delegate voting exactly how your constituents want? Are you a trustee and you're just going to vote what you think is in the best interest? Or a politico, which is kind of like a mix. Or you could be partisan too. There's some members of Congress that are like, how are the Republicans voting? Okay, that's how I'm going to vote. How are the Democrats voting? Okay, that's how I'm going to vote. And it's not even about, that is ideological in that sense, but it tends to just be like, oh, this is just straight party. And we're just going to do a straight party vote here. Okay, so gerrymandering and redistricting, that appears in Unit 5, but it could also show up in Unit 2 also. So we'll go over that real quick. Just remember that reapportionment happens every 10 years after the census. In fact, we're doing it right now, and they're going to go through and count the population and then basically go, okay, you're going to get some new houses or seats in the House, or more basically people to represent you. And they reapportion those out. Then the states need to redistrict. That's just redrawing all the lines, basically. And then gerrymandering happens because then the Republicans and Democrats are like, hey, let's rig it so just our system is benefited, that kind of stuff. So I have a good crash course on that if you want to review on gerrymandering. It may appear, it may not. It really just depends. Our essential Supreme Court cases are the two ones on gerrymandering. It's Baker v. Carr and Shaw v. Reno. Baker v. Carr was just the idea of that, you could challenge districts and how they were drawn up. And then Shaw v. Reno was just that it's okay to gerrymander, but you cannot do it racially, basically, even if it's to help a race, because that was they wanted to draw a district that was a majority black district, basically. So they were actually drawing the funky lines to help a race, but the Supreme Court was like, yeah, no, we really can't do that. We want to have a colorblind constitution. Okay, so got some crash course videos on Congress right there. How does a bill become a law? It's difficult, but that's just basically this is a outline, a little chart thing that just basically shows, you can start it in either house. It's going to have to go through both houses eventually, though. All right, got some great videos on that too. Okay, enduring understanding. The president's been enhanced beyond its express constitutional powers. So yeah, for sure. I mean, just knowing that the president's doing more probably than the founders initially intended to. One of the things I love about so like you see political cartoons and this kinds of stuff. You know, we see presidents trying to become kings and that kind of stuff. That's a common thing I see in political cartoons. Or this one with Obama. You know, what's funny is Obama used to teach constitutional law, which is weird because most of our presidents don't have like a background in it. And when he was running for office, he was like, you know, the president really shouldn't be doing that much, and we need to return more power to Congress and that kind of stuff. And then he became president, and he was like, oh, well, I'd rather have that power. So it's kind of funny. He says, my constitutional law, my views on constitutional laws have somewhat changed since becoming president. Basically saying like, I should have all the power. Okay, explain how president can implement their policy agenda. So they both have formal and informal powers. They have the vetoes, the pocket vetoes, their foreign policy. Probably they have the most influence on bargaining persuasion. They can issue executive orders, those laws that aren't really laws, but have the effect or the force of law, and that doesn't have to go through Congress, basically. But they can be overturned by future presidents. Signing statements are basically like signing, this is how I plan to enforce it, or this is how I plan to do this. Okay, so what are the formal constitutional powers of the president? Appointment power, choosing who gets to serve in office, convening Congress, telling them to get together, power to make treaties, veto power, power to receive ambassadors, basically accept leaders of foreign nations, the commander-in-chief, so in charge of the military, pardoning power, you can pardon only for federal crimes. The president does have the ability to pardon all federal criminals, and then power to faithfully execute the laws. So as you can see, I've got a political cartoon here. This is a criticism of Bush. And like I said, you can find it for all the presidents. Every political cartoonist has drawn that this is a president that's gone out of control with executive power and stuff like that. And, you know, it really depends on your ideology. Republicans say, no, Bush is fine. Democrats say, oh, he's out of control. And then vice versa. It's really interesting that depending on who's in power, the kind of ideological views, you know, differ and that kinds of stuff. Because there was a lot of Republicans complaining, going, oh, Obama's taking on too much power. And now they're saying, oh, no, Trump's fine. We think he's doing, you know, that kinds of stuff. So definitely ideology will help to dictate how you feel about how a president is executing the laws or how they're doing things. They also have informal powers. They're kind of a legislative leader in that they can kind of push through legislation. They're the leader of their political party. They can recruit people to serve in government. Also build morale and use that bully pulpit power to kind of speak out and try to persuade not only other members of government, but also the people as well. Okay, crash courses on the president. There you go. Now explain how the president's agenda can create tension and frequent confrontations with Congress. That has kept coming up. They want you to know, and that's definitely a possibility for the concept application question, or even the argument essay if they asked about what did the founders intend around the powers of the Congress, the powers of the presidency, that kinds of stuff. Just know that they fight. And there's also potential for conflict. And part of that is by design of the Constitution. We wanted them to be conflicting with each other so that we could get the best laws and the best policies, basically. Part of the potential for conflict is that the Senate does have to approve presidential appointments. And even President Trump the other day went on TV and he said, there's a person appointed that is just sitting there in committee and they're not doing anything right. So he's complaining and saying, you know, you should be doing something about that. Also that the president gets to appoint judges, and that's probably his longest lasting influence. And that also he can, if Congress isn't doing anything, and Obama definitely did this with immigration, he's like, Congress is not passing an immigration law. I'm going to issue an executive order so that to protect like dreamers and stuff like that, basically. And so that's something where the president can go, you know, if Congress isn't going to do anything, I'll issue an executive order. And of course, it only lasts as long as I'm here, but at least then we can enforce this and try to get this done. Okay, so executive orders, again, it's a way for presidents can circumvent or go around Congress. Executive privilege is basically keeping stuff secret. Sometimes the president will say, I don't have to reveal that because that's like, you know, private discussions between me and my advisors. And then executive agreements, if a president can't get a treaty passed, they'll just do an executive agreement. It's basically the same thing. It's just not a treaty in name, because a treaty in name in the Constitution, it's required that it goes through Senate approval. And so because it's not getting that, we can't call it that, basically. But it is basically the same thing. It's not technically law, though. I guess a future president could change that much easier than just overturning it. Okay, explain how presidents have interpreted and justified their use of formal and informal powers. A lot of that is in Fed 70, where Hamilton is basically saying the responsibilities of the president and also why we should only have one executive. We also put constitutional power restrictions on the president. We have the 22nd Amendment, which basically says that the presidents can only serve 2 terms. And then, different presidents have different views on like how much power should they have and what should they do with that power and stuff like that. And that's definitely changed over time. So I've got some political cartoons here. There's Andrew Jackson, like I said, this is back in the day saying, born to command, like he's a king. Explain how communication technology has changed the president's relationship with the constituency with other branches. I think this is national constituency. Sorry, some of my stuff I can't read. The communication impact the president can be demonstrated through such factors as modern technology. So know that presidents are now using social media and modern technology to try to respond to issues and get their message out there. And that also they have that State of the Union address, which is when the president is using his bully pulpit to basically set the agenda and tell people this is what you should do or this is what you follow. Okay, federal courts. So what should we know about the federal courts? The structure, basically, we should know what judicial review is, and then also philosophy, how decisions are implemented, and then precedent as well. So as you can see, this is the structure of the courts. It's a 3-tiered system. Basically, let's say you want to sue the Congress or you think a law is unconstitutional. Well, you don't go straight to the Supreme Court. That would be ridiculous. They wouldn't be able to handle that amount of cases. So you would start in this lower court. And then if you don't like the decision or if the person that you're fighting against doesn't like the decision, both you have the ability to appeal and go to the second level. And then if you don't like the decision there, then you have the ability to appeal again to the Supreme Court, who may or may not hear your case. So it just depends if they think it's a constitutional issue or if maybe they just don't even like the issue that they're like, forget it, we're just not going to listen to it. So it's really up to them on what cases they hear, what they don't hear. Okay, so judicial branch. The enduring understanding is that the design of the judicial branch protects the court's independence as a branch of government, and emergence and use of judicial review remains a powerful judicial practice. So what's judicial review? It's their power to overturn laws, overturn actions of the president, state laws, congressional laws, whatever it is. If you check out that picture right there, last year, I dressed up as Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I dressed up as a Supreme Court justice. So that's what I looked like right there. And that's, I guess, me using my power of judicial review. Okay, so Article 3 is basically laying out the federal courts, their structure. Fed 78 is basically laying out the explanation of the judicial branch and why we should not fear it. Marbury v. Madison was the case that established judicial review. Okay, so what is it? Again, it's the power to overturn actions of the Congress, the president. It's really the only check that the Supreme Court has or that the courts have. It's not mentioned specifically in the Constitution. It was established in Marbury v. Madison, and I've got a really great video where you can check out more and learn more about it right there. So Marbury v. Madison, again, details around this case. This case was like such a minor paperwork issue. Like a judge didn't get a piece of paper and he didn't get a job. But it was also a fight between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists as far as power of the president and that kinds of stuff. More importantly, not so much who was involved, but the outcome. This is such a who cares about the issues, the facts? A judge wanted a job, he couldn't get it, and person didn't deliver his piece of paper kind of thing. The power of judicial review is much more important that came out of that, basically. So there's Marbury and Madison. Explain how the exercise of judicial review in conjunction with life tenure can lead to debate about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court's power. So when they use judicial review, sometimes that upsets people because people are like, who are these judges who are passing this law? And they're not passing a law, but what they're doing has the effect of law. Their ruling does affect everybody in their daily lives. Like, for example, after the gay marriage decision, there were people protesting. There were people celebrating for sure. I was excited. But there were definitely people protesting and going, this isn't fair. And we passed laws. We voted on this. And I can definitely sympathize with those people because they're feeling like their representative democracy isn't being represented for what they want. If you're a state and you don't want gay marriage, some people would say then you should be allowed to choose that as your state. The issue is that even though majority rule matters, the Constitution also protects the rights of the minority. And that's what Fed 10 is all about, basically. And so even though, it was a very controversial decision, and I think they made the right decision, obviously, people definitely will question, is it legitimate? These 9 people in robes, and really when it's a Supreme Court case, it can just be 5 people who they don't know. who are wearing these fancy robes going, this is how you have to live your life or your law is not okay. I can understand why people would get definitely upset about that and question, like, is this legitimate? Because if you just had one different person, maybe they would have ruled the other way. And that's not an incorrect statement. Okay, so precedents and stare decisis play an important role in judicial decision-making. Remember that precedents are basically those rulings or future guidelines that, so I make a ruling and I say, here's the precedent that's established, and then future courts or future judges are supposed to follow those. They can reject those. They can establish new ones, though, and that happens all the time. For example, Plessy v. Ferguson, the precedent established was separate but equal. And then 60 years later in Bremer's Board of Education, they said that precedent sucks. And we're going to establish a new precedent that separate is inherently unequal, so that we don't want separation or segregation in our states. Definitely, though, then that causes people to, challenge the court, especially after that Brown versus Board of Education decision. You had people saying they should, impeach those justices and they shouldn't serve on the court and that kinds of stuff. Or are they being too active in their philosophy? Maybe some people would say we want them to exercise more restraint. So the selection of judges is really, really important. It's probably the most important thing that a president will do. And that's because, a president now can only serve for 8 years or 2 terms, but the judges will be there for life, basically. So even long after a president is gone, even after they've left office or they've passed away, you're still going to have their policy influence through these judges, basically. People that Reagan appointed are still on the courts. So even though Reagan has been dead for 20 years now, he's still having an influence on, public policy and stuff like that. So definitely presidents take that responsibility very seriously. It's interesting because each one of these presidents has got 2 appointments. Well, Obama should have had 3, actually. They kind of took one from him. That was not nice. But each of them. So Clinton appointed 2, Bush appointed 2, Obama appointed 2, and Trump has right now currently also appointed 2 so far. So president does have to consider the Senate as well. And, there was someone that Bush appointed. He tried to appoint like his personal lawyer. And then the Senate was like, oh, no, we don't really like that person. We don't think they're qualified enough. Okay, so precedents, again, those are those guides that I just talked about that they should follow. Stare decisis is this principle that you should follow past precedents. You should honor them. And it does allow for kind of continuity in the system, so that's good. Okay, restraint versus activism. The big thing about restraint versus activism is that restraint is when a judge is saying, I'm not elected by the people, so I'm not going to overturn that law. I'm not going to overturn the action of the president who is democratically elected. I'm going to issue restraint. I'm going to handcuff myself and not make that ruling. Activism is like, I'm going to overturn that because I think that was wrong, basically. Okay, explain how other branches in the government can limit the Supreme Court's power. So what are things that the Congress can do? What are things the president can do? Congress can pass new legislation to try to clarify. Like, technically, they shouldn't pass the same law over again. I mean, they could, but then the court would likely just overturn it again. But they could change it. They could tweak it. Or sometimes the court can say, hey, we just don't like this part of the law. If you just change this piece, then we think it's constitutional, kind of thing. Constitutional amendments. So definitely, if you don't like the decision of a court, then you could amend the Constitution. That's, a kind of major option, very rare, but it could happen for sure. Judicial appointments and confirmations. So appointing new people who won't rule that way, that's a possibility for future appointments and that kinds of stuff. Also, you could just ignore them. You could just be like, oh, hey, yeah, like, there were a couple counties that ignored the gay marriage decision. Eventually, that got, brought up and eventually got, solved and that kind of stuff. But there was some pushback initially where people were like, we're just not going to issue the certificates and stuff like that. Again, that's like Andrew Jackson going, hey, you issued your decision. Now go ahead and enforce it. Okay, so implementing judicial decisions. There's the quote right there. Remember that courts must rely on other units of government to carry out their directives. They are just judges in robes who write down opinions. That's it. They don't have money. They don't have power as far as like actual execution power to enforce and stuff like that. They don't really have an army or anything like that to actually make sure that we're actually going along with what they say. So implementing laws is up to Congress and the president. And implementing judicial decisions is up to Congress and the president, basically. Okay, we're almost there. So federal bureaucracy is a power institution in implementing federal policies with sometimes questionable accountability. So what is the bureaucracy? They are the big agencies and departments. They're all in charge of basically enforcing all our laws. We should know the transition, the evolution of our bureaucracy, iron triangles and issue networks, and then oversight. How can we actually hold the bureaucracy accountable? So what is it? It's basically part of the executive branch. They enforce the laws. Got some great crash courses on there if you want to check those out. They're not listed specifically, but cabinet departments are mentioned in the Constitution. President chooses who serves in those. Senate does confirm. How do they carry out responsibilities? They write and enforce regulations. They issue fines. They can testify before Congress, informing Congress, letting them know, hey, this is what's happening, or this is what we're monitoring, that kinds of stuff. And then issue networks and also iron triangles as well. For example, we have the Center for Disease Control, and they're working overtime right now, trying to figure out both learn about this virus, learn how we can both get better testing, learn how we can try to maybe develop a vaccine and all that kinds of stuff. And the Center for Disease Control is on top of that right now, trying to figure out, okay, what are the things that we need to do to try to get us, get our people healthy and address this public health concern. So iron triangles and issue networks. Iron triangles, remember those basically tight relationships between Congress, bureaucracy, and the interest groups. Basically, they all work together. It's like a three-way alliance. Call it an iron triangle because it's very difficult to get in if you're not part of it. Issue networks are sort of like iron triangles, but they're bigger, broader. They're not as strict. They don't only include those three. Definitely those three can be in an issue network, but you can also include the media in that, or experts. They're much more loose and informal. They just kind of debate issues and stuff like that, try to influence them. So remember that we used to have a spoils system where basically the people who voted for the president and the people that supported the president got jobs. Totally bad system though, because you have a lot of incompetence and that kinds of stuff. So that spoils system was really bad. And then we went to a merit system based on your competence and that kinds of stuff. So now if you want to work for the federal government, if you know President Trump, that could give you a high level position actually. If you knew him, but then again, the Senate still would have to confirm it. But if it's a lower level position, you're knowing President Trump will not help you at all, because they're just going to go, no, you need to pass this test and show us that you can do it. We're not going to hire you for the post office just because you know Donald Trump or because you voted for him or something like that. That'd be silly. Okay, so how did the federal bureaucracy use this delegated discretionary authority for rulemaking and implementation? So basically, just remember that these agencies have a lot of discretion in how they implement, how they issue fines, and they also can create rules because Congress creates these vague laws, and so they can come in and tighten it up and put more specifics in there and that kind of stuff. These are the specific departments that are mentioned in your curriculum, so you can just take a look at those. I don't think you need to know the specifics about each and what they do, though. So just remember that the bureaucracy has power because of the discretionary rulemaking authority, basically, and then solving disputes. Again, these are some agencies that are mentioned specifically: the Federal Election Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Reserve Board. These top two are basically commissions that are in charge of enforcing laws. And then the Federal Reserve, we know, is in charge of monetary policy. Okay, explain how Congress uses its oversight power in relationship with the executive branch. So the Congress definitely gives a lot of authority to the government agencies, but they want to have oversight so they can basically see what they're doing. So congressional oversight is specifically Congress overseeing what the bureaucracy is doing and basically holding a magnifying glass and going are you actually enforcing the laws properly? Are you actually spending the money how you said you would? And are you actually doing a good job in helping the American people and providing the services that we've tasked you to perform and stuff like that? So, this is an example of a oversight hearing where if an agency messes up, they'll have to go before Congress and the head will have to explain this is why this happened and we're really sorry, or this is how we corrected this issue and that kind of stuff. And then Congress can reduce funding. They can, put more rules or restrictions. They can write new legislation and say they can't do that anymore. It's just basically a way for Congress to make sure that the laws that they wrote are actually being enforced in the way that they meant them to be enforced, basically. And the president is just going, oh, this is the laws that I want to enforce, and this is how. So oversight is review, monitoring, supervision, and especially if a problem happens, that's what you're going to see a lot more oversight bringing in to just address that. So Congress can check the executive branch by using oversight, by doing committee hearings. They have the power of the purse because they control all the funding, basically. And that's how they can basically authorize spending and appropriation and stuff. So, for example, the president wants to build a wall, and actually we're dealing with some conflict around this because Congress didn't fund it. And so he started taking money from other areas that was allocated for other things. And now you have some senators that are upset about that because money that was supposed to go to their states is now not, because it's going to this wall construction. And now they kind of sued the president and said, hey, maybe you shouldn't be able to use that money for that, basically. So that's going through the courts right now. Okay, how can Congress exercise control over the executive branch and departments? They do have, again, the power of the purse, the committee hearings, oversight. They can confirm or reject people that he appoints. And it can write new legislation clarifying rules, or they could even eliminate entire agencies if they wanted to. If they were like, the CDC is actually bad for this and we don't want them. Like, of course, I don't think they would ever do that. But if they thought it was bad or negative, then they could say, okay, we're just going to eliminate it and it doesn't exist anymore. We're not going to fund it. It's not going to exist. So explain how the president ensures the executive branch executive branch agencies and departments carry out their responsibilities in concert with the goals of the administration. So this is like one of my favorite political cartoons, because it's like President Trump saying like, let's show you who's boss, basically. And then the bureaucracy is like, oh, you have to fill out these forms in triplicate first, and it'll take 10 to 20 years to process, which is funny because it's both a joke on the bureaucracy as far as like how long it takes to get things done sometimes, but it's also a joke on President Trump and just basically like that he doesn't understand that like he can say he's going to do all these things, but it's very difficult to actually get long substantive changes in the bureaucracy, especially because they know, hey, you're only here for 4 years, 8 years, maybe. And then we're always going to be here kind of thing. Okay. Explain the extent to which governmental branches can hold the bureaucracy accountable given the competing interests of Congress, the president, and the federal courts. So another great political cartoon where it's President Trump going, who knew it could be so complicated? And what's choking him? The bureaucracy is not allowing him to do things. The Congress and the courts are basically limiting him in the stuff that he wants to try to get done, maybe because they think it's unconstitutional, or they maybe just disagree ideologically with what he wants to do. Okay. There we are. Awesome. We got through it. Okay, this was a long one, so I apologize. Hopefully you're still with me and you're still there. I will create another video for Unit 3. Unit 2 is very long, so I appreciate you guys hanging in there with me. I love you all. You're all amazing people. Let's keep studying. Let's keep reviewing. And keep checking into Google Classroom, because I'll try to do more Google Meets and stuff like that. And let me know if you have any questions or if you want to do an individual meet or anything like that. All right, so I'm going to say goodbye to this. You have to exit and stop sharing. Okay, finish recording. All right, guys, love you.